On the government whip, deliver the closing remarks for the government side.
Mr. Speaker, Sir Adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, it's really interesting here, Mr. Foss and myself, an American and Irish combination speaking for a Scottish university, a combination designed for the specific purpose of beating up English teams. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me that Western Ontario came up here and talked about consistency of goals when all we saw from them was a consistency of moving goalposts. Because, ladies and gentlemen, Oxford gave us a very, very clear definition in terms of the morality of a foreign policy that stresses morality, ladies and gentlemen. A specific trend in foreign policy that they identified. Gray's Inn's question in a very nitpicking point where this trend exists. Ladies and gentlemen, it's quite simple. There have been more sanctions imposed in the last 20 years on nation states than at any previous stage of the 20th century. We have seen the development and the evolution of the use of trade and sanctions as a tool of foreign policy. And the question is, do we approve of this trend? Mr. Foss introduced the point for Edinburgh. Well, you see, ladies and gentlemen, the problem with hurting trade and the problem with sanctions is precisely this. The damage you inflict doesn't harm the ruling elites of the country. The ruling elites you're trying to target. It inflicts itself on the poor. It inflicts itself on the areas of development, ladies and gentlemen, the poor sections of society. This point, no thank you, sir, has remained completely unchallenged and completely undenied by the opposition. So the question is, ladies and gentlemen, to why should we impose this harm? Are there clear counter-arguments, ladies and gentlemen, against the argument that sanctions by themselves merely hurt the poor? Ladies and gentlemen, Oxford gave you 3 very good reasons why the morality of why a policy which is allegedly moral, even though it consists of inflicting harm on poor sections of society, is nonsensical. The first point they gave, that this allegedly moral policy contributes to international instability, ladies and gentlemen. Their second point is that it's fundamentally inconsistent. And their third solution, ladies and gentlemen, is that constructive engagement is a much better way of doing this. Edinburgh came up here and gave the extension, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Foss showed you that essentially, if you move towards constructive engagement, you're going to move towards a system of encouraging development, economic development within states, to create the economic development and economic bedrock that will potentially allow the evolution and development of a democratic society. He pointed out, ladies and gentlemen, that what trade does, it links countries into a system of international norms, whether it's the World Trade Organization, other norms, ladies and gentlemen. It links them into a system of shared exchange, a system of economic development, ladies and gentlemen, which improves the basic human rights of these people. And let's face it, we can whinge all we like about the lack of free speech in so many countries. But if people are suffering from desperate poverty, ladies and gentlemen, it may very well be necessary to develop the economic fundamentals first, and that's what trade hits. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, what cutting off trade is that it retards economic development. It impedes the evolution of a civil society based on a firm economic bedrock. Sir.
Can you please explain why the Middle East, which is one of the richest regions of the world, with all the trade that they've had in oil, is no farther along in human rights development?
We'll tell you precisely, sir, ladies and gentlemen. We'll tell you precisely, sir. Firstly, we could cite specific examples in Jordan, which has attempted, ladies and gentlemen, to move towards a greater system of democracy based on progressive evolution. We would point out that the Middle East is a situation of immense global instability. And we would further point out, sir, and this is moving on to the entire point from the opposition, the point of consistency, ladies and gentlemen. You see, Oxford came up here and said our moral foreign policy is inherently inconsistent. And then Gray stood up and said, there's nothing wrong with this, in that democratic nations select by votes, by the process of people electing for a democratic government that carries out a foreign policy. They select these policies, and that's not inconsistent. But the point is, ladies and gentlemen, that an inconsistent foreign policy that sanctions Iraq and that doesn't sanction Israel, that sanctions Cuba but doesn't sanction China, you have to ask yourself, if you're trying to get a message across, what message are you sending? Are you sending a message? No, thank you, sir. And this is the problem. This is the problem with inconsistency point, ladies and gentlemen. And Oxford raised this point, and we're showing you how it inflicts. That quite simply, if a democratic government, for instance that of Great Britain, decides to sanction Iraq and not to sanction Israel, what incentive are you providing, ladies and gentlemen, for countries to move towards democracy? Because the only message you are sending, which are allegedly moral foreign policy aimed at getting more democracy, the only message you are sending, you're not sending the message that democracy is in some way essential. What you're saying is to be on the right side of the West is essential. In other words, this is the flaw with the inconsistency. It's the flaw with the inconsistency targeted by Oxford, ladies and gentlemen, because quite simply what we're seeing is this. Inconsistency damages a clear line. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've had right down here a system of constructive engagement. We want a system of constructive engagement and constructive development, ladies and gentlemen. We want an integration of countries such as China, such as other human rights abusers, ladies and gentlemen, into a system of international interaction, a system, ladies and gentlemen, which won't exclude them, which won't leave them out in the cold, which won't operate, ladies and gentlemen, to essentially cut these countries off from the process of establishing international norms, which won't exclude them from the process, ladies and gentlemen, of growing economic development, growing international integration into an international community that looks for certain norms. We want, ladies and gentlemen, to have trade policies that are moral in that they make sense, ladies and gentlemen, as opposed to the do-gooderism, the vacant do-gooderism that simply lashes out in a very blunt fashion. We want an intelligent foreign policy as opposed to a knee-jerk moralism, ladies and gentlemen. Quite simply want a foreign policy that will a foreign policy in trade terms that will set out to achieve what we want to do, and we think the proposition has clearly shown this. Thank you very much.